Welcome to the Rod Chappell Show. I'm Rod Chappell, and this is a program where we bring real-life issues into focus, where the law meets the road, helping people, our citizens of Missouri and other states, better understand their place in the society and the roles that we have. Today, we are delighted to have a friend, a colleague, a fellow steward of the community, David Barrett. Dave, welcome to the show.
Rod, it's always a pleasure to see you.
Thank you. Thank you. Dave, and before we get into our program, and I know we're going to talk about the Castle Doctrine and self-defense and what that means to Missourians, can you tell us about yourself?
Sure. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and back when I was a little kid, they used to have this television show called Adam 12. And like a lot of little boys of my generation, we wanted to grow up and be policemen. And that's what I did. I did that for several years, and quite frankly, got interested in employment law, went to law school, was lucky enough to go to Brigham University's J. Reuben Clark Law School. From there, I moved back to Missouri, which is where my family has lived for generations in the Lafayette County area, started a law practice, and eventually worked my way to Jefferson City. Here, I practice law in cases involving professional licensing, real estate agents, dentists, funeral directors, for any of the several dozen professions that require state license. That's the kind of case that I handle these days. I've kept my interest in law enforcement. I have what's called a reserve commission as a law enforcement officer here in central Missouri, and I do that because I teach at the police academy, and quite frankly, the youngsters pay a lot more attention to me when they think I actually do what I talk about.
I can only imagine. And didn't you recently get an award or an honor? I don't want to embarrass you here, but from the county where you served?
Yeah, the Miller County Sheriff was kind enough to name me Reserve Deputy of the Year. It was a surprise and an honor.
Hey. Well, it's a rare quality to have a lawyer who's also working in law enforcement. I know there are a few, but they're not a lot. One of the things we wanted to talk about was the Castle Doctrine and self-defense. I know over the last several years, and recently there's been a lot of legislation that is essentially just putting the arms or guns in the hands of people and making sure that folks know when to use them, when not to use them. This is not a gun safety course, but in some ways it kind of is, right?
One of the things that I always start with, Rod, is I don't like guns. I was raised in a large city. Jefferson City is the smallest town that I've ever lived in with 45,000 neighbors. So a lot of the things that apply to folks that live in small towns and in rural communities aren't necessarily something that I particularly appreciate or understand as far as have I lived there. But the fact of the matter remains that the typical person who's injured by a firearm is a family member or a friend of the person that owns the gun. Guns are dangerous. The American Academy of Pediatrics said, you want to reduce homicides, you want to reduce gun injuries, you want to keep kids safe, don't have a gun in your house. The vast majority of firearm injuries are suicides and accidents. The actual use of a firearm in self-defense is a much smaller subset of the number of people who are actually injured or killed by firearms tragically every year.
That's completely counter to the narrative that we hear in popular discourse a lot, right? That you got to have a gun to protect yourself or somebody else. The idea that the thing that you were hoping was going to protect you could actually kill you or your loved ones more than it would ever be useful in any other regard is kind of scary.
And that's a fact that a lot of people don't appreciate and draws a lot of contention every time I mention it. It can't be. Yeah. If you don't believe it, look at the numbers for yourself.
Right. Well, that's important. Well, do you want to talk about the Castle Doctrine?
Sure, but before we talk about the Castle Doctrine, I think we need to talk about regular self-defense law first, because the Castle Doctrine is a special subset of self-defense law.
Okay. Tell us more about that.
Now, we've always had self-defense law, back before we even had a legislature, before we had statutes. Back in merry old England, where some of my ancestors came from, we had what was called common law self-defense. And you hear a lot about common law self-defense because one of the primary principles of it was what was called the duty to retreat. And that becomes important when we talk about the Castle Doctrine. The duty to retreat said that before you could use force in self-defense, you had to try to get away. You had to run away before you could fight under the common law.
Okay.
The statutes have changed that, and in Missouri it is eminently clear that generally speaking you don't have a duty to retreat. You don't have to run away. Sometimes you hear this called stand your ground.
Okay, yep, I've heard that.
Before you can use force, you don't necessarily have to run away, although frankly I'll tell you it might be the best idea. But legally you're not required to. But before, and to make sure I get it right, I'm going to put on my glasses, but before you use any kind of force in self-defense under Missouri law, you have to reasonably believe the force is necessary to defend yourself or a third person, your spouse, your kids, your neighbor, from what you reasonably believe to be the use of imminent unlawful force by another person. Now that's any force. A push, a shove, somebody's just up in your face, so to speak.
Okay.
Before you can use any force, you have to believe that force is going to be used against you or some other person that you're protecting.
All right. And so, Dave, if and aside from the firearms, so we're saying if we're just confronted in a parking lot or something weird like that by a person who might want to fight, we have to believe that they're going to hit us?
That's right.
Okay.
And a different example that makes it a little bit clear that I use when I teach is the telephone.
Okay.
Someone calls you up on the phone and they say, Rod, I'm going to whoop up on you. You now can't go out looking for them because they threatened you over the phone. They lacked that there was a lack of that imminent use of unlawful force on you. Why? Because you were talking by phone. What's the threat? Another story that comes up sometimes is the person's at your door. Open this door or I'm going to whoop you. What's your defense? Don't open the door. Perhaps that's the wisest choice you can make. And yet we hear stories all the time. If something like that happens, a person beats on the door, says open the door or I'm going to whoop you, and then they shoot through the door. Uh-oh, now we have a problem. Was there an imminent threat? And that's the first question the cops and the prosecutors are going to be looking at. And then if you guess wrong, it's the question that a judge and a jury are going to be looking at.
Gotcha. Okay. When I interrupted you on that, so the imminent needs to be something that's close, that could actually happen.
That's right.
And then what about this reasonable belief? How does what does that mean?
Well, let's take a little child.
Okay.
Sometimes little children will say some crazy things. They'll see something on TV, they'll try to repeat it. I'm going to kill you. A 6-year-old is probably not an immediate threat to your average adult. A tragedy that we saw recently was a person who was armed with a knife, indisputably, but in a powered wheelchair. The question becomes, how can that person carry out the threats, even though they're armed, even though they're in your immediate presence? Is there truly a danger? And that's a question that has to be answered.
Gotcha. Okay. And who gets to actually make that decision? Is that going to be at the end of the day the jury or?
Well, the first person that's responsible for that decision is you. Is this a place you want to be? Is this something you want to do?
Right.
And that's a question that comes up all the time. How do you and I avoid problems? Do we, I happen to know you and I haven't been out drinking in downtown St. Louis any time in the recent past. We've kind of matured out of that. Our spouses don't appreciate when we do that sort of thing anymore, so we're never in the situation.
Right.
And that goes right back to, how do I avoid this problem? Don't have it in the first place. That's sometimes the best. The second person that you're going to have to deal with is the responding law enforcement officer. Anytime that there's that kind of use of force, somebody's going to call the cops at some point. If it's in a public place or where the public knows about it, the police response will be immediate. The police response might be delayed, but at some point when a person shows up at a hospital with a gunshot wound or other serious injury, the police are going to be notified and there are going to be questions asked.
Yes.
So that's the second line. How are you going to deal with law enforcement? One of the best things that we can tell you, you and I will know, sometimes people forget, is you probably don't want to be talking to the police about what happened until you've had a chance to talk to your lawyer and decide what's the best decision for you, because really, truly, these things can end up in a situation where things can be misunderstood, stories can be told incorrectly, understanding can be confused, especially in the immediate aftermath of a situation.
Yes.
And sometimes it's not always the best choice.
Wow. Well, and that's absolutely right. You know, the statements that can come off, it's funny how ambiguous we can be with our normal talk, right? But when you're asking specific questions, particularly by law enforcement, you need to have answers that are responsive to those questions, but thought out, because they're not asking you for fun, right?
And in the mind of the public, either way, it's going to spin badly. You didn't react in the way they thought you should. You must be guilty. You reacted with a lot of emotion. You must be guilty. It doesn't matter what you do, somebody's going to look at you askance.
Boy. Well, and I think the biggest takeaway as we move into the second segment of our show is that personal responsibility, you know, that reasonable belief, that having that start with the person is so important. And if we're going to maintain a respectful and law-abiding society where people can be safe, we need to think about the other person, not just what we're allowed to do, but is it good and proper for the right situation?
That's absolutely true. Do you need a gun in the first place? Is it more dangerous to your family than it's likely to protect them?
Boy. Thanks for joining us on this segment of the Rod Chappell Show. We're going to come back with part 2, where we're going to continue talking about self-defense in Missouri and about the Castle Doctrine as a special subset of self-defense. I hope I got that right, Dave.
You did.
All right, good. Our friend David Barrett will be back with us on the second segment. Thank you.
Talking to your kids about finishing school isn't easy, just necessary. Call 866-STUDIO or go to boostup.org for materials that can help.
Hey, how's it going?
Sir, are you okay?
What? Oh, this? It's probably nothing. I'm sure it'll go away.
Go away? But, sir, that can't be good.
No, it's cool, really.
Do you want a napkin or something?
Everything's fine. Thanks.
You wouldn't ignore this, so why ignore the signs of a stroke? At the first warning signs, call 911 immediately, because time lost is brain lost.
Welcome back to the Rod Chappell Show. We are delighted to continue the discussion that we've been having about self-defense, about the Castle Doctrine, and really about rights and responsibilities of Missouri citizens. We are delighted to have David Barrett with us today. Not only a lawyer, but also a peace officer, a rare combination of a human being and a true steward of the community. David, thanks again for being with us.
It's my pleasure, Rod.
Thanks. We were talking about the self-defense as we are approaching what it means to live up to our rights and obligations here as citizens.
Right.
This is a real facet, and I think in the last segment, and I encourage everybody to watch that, but the overall advice would have been, don't have a gun unless you got a serious reason to have it, knowing that there's a substantial danger in having one.
But you have to make good decisions.
Yeah.
And those decisions need to be based on facts and what really happens in the world with other people.
Yes, that's right. Well, we talked about reasonable belief and the first and second line of that determination being with the person, the second being with law enforcement who are going to respond to a situation, and then I guess maybe the courts come in after that?
They do. If law enforcement decides that something was done wrong, then you have to answer to your peers in the form of the judges and the juries that we bring out of our own communities.
Dave, that can be expensive, can't it?
That's what I hear. I don't do criminal defense, but from people I know that have had to retain criminal defense attorneys, your house is going up on the block most likely.
Yeah, and that's win, lose, or draw.
Yeah, there is no reimbursement under United States law for a successful defense.
Right. Well, what else should we know about self-defense law in Missouri?
When you go beyond just general self-defense and you start talking about deadly force, which is any sort of firearm, if you're using a firearm or just about any kind of weapon, you're talking about the use of deadly force. And the law looks at deadly force even more narrowly than it does force in general. You have to reasonably believe that deadly force is necessary to protect yourself. Could you have pushed the person away instead of shooting them? Could you have done something else? Would a punch in the mouth have fixed it instead of a stab in the gut? You have to be protecting against death, serious physical injury, or a forcible felony. That doesn't mean that it's okay for people to do bad things for you. It just means that your response needs to be proportional to the threat that is facing you. If the other person has a firearm, then a firearm's an appropriate response. If the other person simply wants to fist fight you, and it's two grown men like you or me, deadly force might be a much more questionable issue. If you're protecting, get a little bit more leeway than if you're just protecting yourself. But you have to consider, is what I am doing reasonable in these circumstances? One kid throws a snowball at the other. Is it reasonable to shoot that child? You and I look at it right now, well, that's a preposterous situation, but it's a situation that comes up.
Wow.
And that's where people get into trouble, because if they have deadly force immediately accessible, sometimes they overreact to it, and then there's a consequence to it.
And I know we've got more to talk about, but where does self-defense come in when you have things like alcohol or drugs, which may be legal or illegally used at the same time?
Sure. What was your reasonable belief? And that's what the law is going to look at. What's your reasonable belief? What's your perception? And drugs and alcohol are going to be the things that cloud that. Every one of us has woke up in the morning and said, I wish I hadn't drank that much the night before. Imagine if other things had happened.
Right. So that would probably be another mark against, was whatever occurred the correct thing or the right thing?
Was your perception of it correct? Was your perception reasonable? Was it reasonable to be under the influence or intoxicated with whatever it is that you were using and have a deadly weapon with you?
Right. And is there a law or a rule that says that if you've been drinking, you shouldn't have a gun?
There's a law that says if you have been drinking and have a firearm and something bad happens, there's consequences. In some states, it's illegal to merely possess a firearm while you're intoxicated. Missouri requires that extra step. Something has to have gone wrong.
Something's got to go wrong. Gotcha.
But that's what really ties us into the Castle Doctrine.
Yes.
Because the Castle Doctrine, what that says is when you're in your home, we will give you a little bit more leeway than we would out in the community, because your home is your castle.
Okay.
Because that is the place that you should be safe. And if someone is trying to bring harm to you in your home, we are going to allow you to use force in self-defense a little bit sooner than we might out at the grocery store. Because there's reasons for other people to be at the grocery store. There's not good reason for someone else to be trying to come into your home without your permission. And that's what the Castle Doctrine is all about. The Castle Doctrine in Missouri has even been expanded to recognizing motor vehicles, something that we've only had for a little over a century now, as an extension of that home, your private place. Not a lot of people get to come into your car unless you invite it. It's a variant of the home itself.
So in your house, I assume that's an apartment, it doesn't matter whether it's a condo, any place that you could live, right?
Your tent.
Your tent. Wow.
There
wow.
was talk years ago in Missouri about, can you protect yourself in your tent if a bear is trying to come in, or the human equivalent of a bad bear.
The bear, I think, no question, right? I hope. And then the car too.
And your car, well, part of that were the problems we were having in Kansas City and St. Louis. I haven't heard about it as much in the last few years, although carjacking's still a problem. I don't think it's quite the pandemic it was 15 years ago, but still something that happens.
Wow. What about if you're on a motorcycle?
Tough question. Again, what is being done? Is the person using force against you? Self-defense is appropriate.
Okay.
Are they using deadly force against you? A deadly response is appropriate.
Right.
Are they cleaning your windshield without your permission? Back on the East Coast, one of those types of deals?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Probably not appropriate, even if you're from Missouri, and that might be a little scary for you.
And so the Castle Doctrine would allow the use of deadly force?
The Castle Doctrine allows the use of deadly force when all of the other elements that allow the use of force are present.
Okay.
You have to have a reasonable belief that it's necessary to defend yourself.
Okay.
If you're going to use deadly force in self-defense, you have to reasonably believe that the deadly force is necessary to protect you from death, serious physical injury, or a forcible felony.
Well, Dave, what's a forcible felony?
Forcible felonies are things like rape, assaults with a deadly weapon, things where weapons are used to overcome resistance, robbery, those sorts of things. It's why we allow you to use force to protect yourself in your house, but we don't let you set booby traps in your house.
Right, because you don't know what that person might necessarily be doing.
The person, well, and you don't know who's going to trigger it. There's a lot of problems with booby traps. We do unfortunately see those every now and again, but is it your kid coming into the booby trap? Is it some innocent passerby? Sure. Out on the West Coast especially, where they have some of the illegal marijuana grows, there's a lot of booby traps protecting those.
Okay.
Innocent people are injured and killed walking into those booby traps, and it does not go over well with the government.
No, I bet not. I bet not. I mean, imagine somebody, a first responder, coming into one of those.
Exactly.
Yeah. What else should we cover about the Castle Doctrine?
Well, the thing with the Castle Doctrine, that covers the situation when you're in your house, the door is closed, there might not be immediate peril.
Okay.
You don't have to wait for the person to actually commit the assault. It's the coming in. Or the other part of the Castle Doctrine is the force is being used against a person who has remained in your house after unlawfully entering.
Okay.
Now, here's the hard part about it. Can you eject a trespasser from your house? Sure you can. They're in your house, they're not supposed to be. You can put the glad hand of fellowship around their shoulders and help them to leave. Can you shoot them while they're sitting in the chair? That's the tough question that people have to answer. Was it reasonably necessary? Was there an immediate threat to you? And that's where sometimes things fall apart for people. They make a decision on the spur of the moment that they end up regretting.
Boy. Dave, we might have time for one or two quick examples or things that you've noted throughout your career. Anything that you think might help our viewing public better understand either the absurdity that you've seen or some good application?
The most typical thing that I've seen go wrong for people is trying to defend their property. You can use force to defend your property. You can't use deadly force to defend property. And where that comes up is when somebody's stealing your car.
Okay.
A lot of times you'll hear about they were stealing my car, and as they drove away, I shot at them. A couple things can go wrong. First off, it's defensive property, not defensive person. What's that immediate threat to you as they are leaving?
Right.
Is there an economic consequence? Yes. That's why we have insurance, though. What if the car's being repossessed, though? Car repossessors get shot at all the time, and when they do, somebody goes to jail.
Yeah.
And when the car repossessor is killed, they go to jail for a long time.
Yes.
So those are unfortunate situations. the porch pirate problem we're having right now, the porch pirate pandemic. If you see somebody on your porch and they don't belong there and you shoot through the door, the question's going to be, what was the threat? If the threat was they were going to steal my Amazon order, we've got a real problem. If the threat is it's your ex-significant other and they've come with a gun and the Castle Doctrine comes into play, different kind of issue. But do you really want to answer the door with a gun in your hand?
Right.
It takes away some of your options. One of the unfortunate situations that I dealt with was kids riding bikes on the lawn and pointing a gun at kids because they're annoying and they're obnoxious and kids are what they are. Pointing guns at little children just isn't going to go over well with anyone.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. Boy, I tell you what. I can't tell you how many questions that, as a lawyer, I've received, how many times that trying to provide that same advice that you gave, Dave. Let's make good choices. Let's make good decisions. You know, we ought to have some respect for the sanctity of life, and certainly killing people over property is a bad idea, you know, especially if they aren't endangering your lives. And I think that the law kind of recognizes that, but feeling as though we've got some authority to move forward in directions that hurt people or maybe even kill them when it's unnecessary, I think that that's going to be my big takeaway today.
I've seen very few people. I've been to a lot of shootings, a lot of stabbings, a lot of other things in my life. Very rarely is there not some feeling that I wish I hadn't gotten into this situation at some point along the way.
Oh yeah, and I imagine that happens as those cuffs are being put on.
Sometimes not, but
Right.
sometimes it takes a little longer than others. But yeah, there's very rarely are people delighted with decisions that they've made, even if they're right. Even if they're right, they're hard and there's consequences.
Yes. Thank you, Dave.
Always a pleasure, my friend.
Thanks for joining us on the Rod Chappell Show. We deeply appreciate the opportunity to bring information to our community and our state. These issues that we're talking about can come up in a spur of a moment. Give them some consideration. If you are worried about the safety of you or another, not only is it a good idea to know about the law, it's a good idea to consider the consequences. Even when you're right, it can be costly, not just to you, but to others. The death of a family member or a loved one is always going to occur whenever there's a death. Is it necessary? Thanks for joining us on the Rod Chappell Show, and we look forward to seeing you again.